Hey everyone, my name is Nehemias, and welcome to the next episode of my podcast, where we talk everything about apologetics, philosophy, and difficult questions in theology. Where we left off last was in describing and looking into the objections, rebuttals, and a possible synthesis between the classical and presuppositional approach of apologetics. And where we last left off was saying that for us to actually start to analyze different philosophical ideas and movements, it was going to be necessary that we got a good grasp on what we call logic, which is the tool that philosophy has used in creating, attacking, defending, and like I said, evaluating different types of arguments. So for Christians, if we're going to do the apologetic work that we're called to do, I think it's necessary for us to study and really understand some of the more technical terms in what we call logic. So let's start here. First off, what is an argument? An argument, I think in more common day language use, is just the kinds of statements that are used between two people who have disagreeing views. So for example, we would consider an argument if you said one thing that was a statement and I said another that was in disagreement with that statement. We would call ourselves to be in an argument. However, an argument is really something that is constructed in the discipline of logic. And arguments can be defined or categorized into two main parts that we call a premise and a conclusion. Now, what are a premise and a conclusion? A premise is, it serves as a reason for believing the conclusion. It's a statement that gives reasons or gives credibility to what we know as a conclusion. And inside of logic, we also have what are called implicit premises. Some premises in everyday language are very easy for us to understand, but what we call implicit premises are the ones that are hidden because of our language. And I'm going to give an example for that here in 1 John chapter 4, verse 20. It says, if someone says, I love God and hates his brother, he is a liar. For he who does not love his brother whom he has seen, how can he love God whom he has not seen? So we have different implicit premises, and oddly enough, we also have an implicit conclusion somewhere in here. And what I mean by implicit is it's not written, it's not what's being actually spoken, but it's what's trying to be communicated. So let me try and set that forth here. What are the premises that we have here? We have a man has seen his brother, a man has not seen God. And here's the implicit premise. If a man does not love what he has seen, then he cannot love what he has not seen. Implicit conclusion. Therefore, a man who does not love his brother cannot love God. But here's the one that we actually have. This is the actual conclusion that's not implicit. Therefore, if a man says, I love God and hates his brother, he is a liar. That's the conclusion that's actually written out in the book of 1 John. But those other two were implicit premises and implicit conclusions that we have there. So the premises, like I said, serve as the backing up, the backbone of why we believe a conclusion. And an argument in general can have any number of premises and can even have what we call sub-arguments. What's an example of a sub-argument? Well, first let's think of arguments as when we wrote papers, like a book review or something, and we wanted to advocate that there was a meaning behind a story, or there was a moral or a theme. Many times we would think of a specific number of reasons inside of our paper, perhaps. And those reasons we would call premises, right? And it could be as many reasons as we want, so long as they connect to going towards the conclusion. Some arguments and these premises could have reasons for our reasons, which is a little bit meta, I know, but let's think that through. There are reasons that we have, and someone can question that reason, and you can give a reason for that reason. And finally, we have what are called sub-arguments, which are different arguments that point to the same conclusion. And we call those chain arguments, made up of what we said were sub-arguments. And for this case, I would just use the example of different arguments for God that argue towards the same conclusion. We could actually put all of those together and make chain arguments for the existence of God. So that's really defining, really basically, what an argument is and the parts of an argument. So going a little bit further inside of logic, we have to define the two kinds of logical arguments that we would encounter. The two kinds of arguments in logic are known as inductive and deductive arguments. These are categories that explain the nature of the argument based on where the content came from. Let's explain this. Inductive arguments achieve probability because if the premises are true, then the conclusion is likely to also be true. Let me give an example here. An example would be premise number 1. The last 4 times it rained, there were clouds overhead. And premise 2 could be, today there are clouds overhead. And the conclusion would be, today it will rain. Now, if we look at that argument, it's considered an inductive argument. Why? Because even if both of the first 2 premises are true, it doesn't mean that the conclusion is a certainty. Rather, we would say that there is a high probability of the conclusion, but a high probability and a certainty inside of logic are in 2 entirely different ordeals. And so an inductive argument only gives us probability. Why? Because simply because rain has happened where there are clouds overhead the last few times it rained, it does not mean, it might be highly likely, but it does not mean with certainty that it will or won't rain on the day that clouds overhead or even on the day that the sun is out and shining. And that's an inductive argument. A deductive argument is different because a deductive argument is one that gives us certainty. Because if both of the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true as well. There is no escaping the certainty of the conclusion. And so deductive arguments are very powerful, but they're also very hard to find, for you to find 2 premises that we can consider to be fully true. Let me give an example of this. An example would be in premise number 1, all men are mortal. Premise number 2, Nemi, myself, is a man. And conclusion number 3 then, Nemi is mortal. Now, this argument is a deductive argument because there's no escaping the conclusion of this argument based on the truthfulness of the 2 premises. It provides a certainty that even the Bible declares for good worth. I'd like to mention it. Hebrews chapter 9 verse 27 says, just as each person is destined to die. So we're talking about the mortality of man here. If I, Nemi, as a man, and if I am a man, there's a quality of mortality that is assumed in also being a man. So this means that the deductive argument, like I said, are the strongest types of argument, but they're also the ones that are very rare because they're based on what we call a priori or innate knowledge that doesn't need any empirical evidence. This contrasts a lot to our inductive argument. Our inductive argument about rain was about probability based on empirical evidence on what we have seen in the past. And this is what we would call a posteriori knowledge or after experience knowledge. And so these are the 2 different qualities by which we create arguments. These are the 2 sources of knowledge in some ways or of information, the 2 sources of information that we create our arguments from. And if we use a priori knowledge or a priori information, then it would be considered a deductive argument because it is not necessary for anything in the world or experience to get in the way of only giving us a probability. Because experience and what we experience are only high probabilities or low probabilities. None of those are certainties in our everyday life. So in conclusion, this is a basic introduction to logic that we're going to continue in our next episode. We're going to talk about how we actually evaluate inductive and deductive arguments. We're going to talk about the laws of logic that cannot be broken and what we would call fallacies that arguments are prone to falling in. And a fallacy is nothing more than just a mess up, a miscommunication, or an error inside of our reasoning. These are the 3 things that we're going to be studying in next week's episode. My name is Nemias, and I hope to hear and be with you in the next episode.